When women ignore you even though they are deeply in love with you, it often feels confusing, painful, and contradictory because love is expected to bring closeness, attention, and warmth, not silence or distance. Yet the truth is that love does not always express itself in obvious ways, especially when emotions run deep and vulnerability feels dangerous. Sometimes a woman ignores you not because she does not care, but because she cares too much, because loving deeply means risking rejection, disappointment, or loss of self-respect, and silence becomes a shield to protect her heart from feeling exposed or powerless. Many women grow up learning that showing too much interest can lead to being taken for granted. So when emotions intensify, they pull back, hoping that distance will restore balance, preserve dignity, or make the other person value them more. In some cases, ignoring you is her way of regaining control when feelings become overwhelming, because love can make a woman feel emotionally dependent, and stepping back helps her breathe, think clearly, and reconnect with her own identity beyond the relationship. There are moments when a woman ignores you because she is testing emotional safety, observing whether you notice her absence, whether you care enough to reach out with sincerity rather than ego, and whether your interest remains consistent without constant reassurance. Sometimes silence is not intentional manipulation, but emotional exhaustion, a response to feeling unheard, unappreciated, or misunderstood, where words feel useless and withdrawal feels easier than explaining pain that may not be taken seriously. Women in love may also ignore you when they sense imbalance, when they are giving more than they are receiving, because love without reciprocity slowly drains the heart, and distance becomes a quiet attempt to restore equality. Fear plays a powerful role too. Fear of moving too fast, fear of losing independence, fear of being vulnerable with someone who may not be equally invested, and in that fear, ignoring becomes a pause button, a way to slow emotions before they spiral beyond control. Past wounds shape present behavior, and a woman who has loved and lost before may associate closeness with pain, so when feelings deepen, she instinctively retreats, not because you are unworthy, but because her heart remembers what it once endured. Ignoring can also be a form of silent communication, a hope that you will understand her emotional language without forcing her to spell out feelings she herself may not fully understand. There are times when she ignores you because she is fighting her own emotions, trying to convince herself not to fall too deeply, especially if circumstances are complicated, timing is wrong, or commitment feels uncertain, and distance feels like the only way to maintain control over a heart that wants to surrender. Importantly, ignoring does not always mean indifference, but it does signal internal conflict, a struggle between desire and self-protection, between wanting closeness and fearing vulnerability. However, it is also essential to recognize that love should not rely on constant guessing or emotional confusion, and prolonged silence can sometimes reflect emotional immaturity, poor communication skills, or unresolved personal issues rather than depth of feeling. Understanding this dynamic requires empathy rather than ego, patience rather than pressure, because forcing attention can push her further away, while calm presence and emotional consistency create safety. Yet self-respect matters equally, because love that causes continuous anxiety or self-doubt needs honest conversation, not endless interpretation. When a woman truly loves you and feels safe, valued, and emotionally secure, ignoring eventually fades, replaced by openness, warmth, and clarity. But until then, her silence often carries unspoken emotions, fears, and hopes that words fail to express, reminding us that love is not always loud, direct, or simple, but deeply human, layered, and shaped by the stories we carry within our hearts. As this silence stretches on, it becomes important to understand that when a woman ignores you while loving you deeply, she is often standing at a crossroads between emotion and self-preservation, trying to decide whether opening her heart further will bring peace or pain, because love for her is not just a feeling but a risk that touches her dignity, her past, and her sense of worth. Sometimes she withdraws to see if you will meet her halfway emotionally rather than chase her impulsively, because what she truly seeks is reassurance through consistency, not desperation or pressure, and she watches quietly to see whether your care remains steady when attention is no longer guaranteed. In other moments, her silence is a response to disappointment she never voiced, small moments where she felt overlooked, misunderstood, or emotionally alone, and instead of confronting these feelings directly, she steps back, hoping distance will either heal the hurt or reveal whether her absence matters to you. Women often process emotions internally, replaying conversations, analyzing tone, and questioning intentions. And during this inner storm, ignoring you becomes a way to sort through feelings without adding more confusion through reactive words. There are also times when she ignores you because she is learning to choose herself, realizing that loving someone should not require losing boundaries, self-respect, or emotional balance. And this withdrawal is not punishment but self-alignment. However, this silence can feel heavy for the person on the other side, creating doubt, anxiety, and unanswered questions, which is why understanding alone is not enough. Communication must eventually replace distance, because love cannot survive indefinitely on assumptions and emotional guessing. If her ignoring is followed by warmth, honesty, and effort, it often means she needed space to reset emotionally. But if silence becomes a pattern with no resolution, it may indicate fear of vulnerability, avoidance of accountability, or an inability to communicate needs clearly. Loving someone deeply does not excuse emotional neglect, and while empathy helps you understand her behavior, self-worth helps you decide what you deserve. The healthiest outcome emerges when both hearts feel safe enough to speak openly, when silence turns into conversation, and when love becomes a shared effort rather than an emotional puzzle, because real love does not thrive on distance forever. It grows in clarity, mutual respect, and the courage to be emotionally present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Over time, the real meaning behind her silence begins to reveal itself through patterns rather than words, because when a woman is deeply in love yet continues to ignore you, she is often battling an inner conflict between her heart's desire and her mind's caution, weighing whether love will bring growth or cost her peace. And this internal struggle can make her appear distant even when emotions remain intense. Sometimes she is waiting for emotional leadership, for reassurance that you understand her without forcing explanations, for proof that you can remain steady, respectful, and emotionally mature even in uncertainty, because stability feels safer than intensity. In other cases, her silence is shaped by unspoken expectations, moments where she hoped you would show up differently, communicate more clearly, or prioritize her feelings. And when those expectations go unmet, withdrawal feels easier than confrontation. It is also possible that she is afraid of dependency, fearing that loving you deeply might make her lose herself, her independence, or her emotional control, and so she creates distance as a way to breathe, recalibrate, and remember who she is outside of the connection. Yet love that hides too long behind silence begins to fade, not because feelings disappear, but because unmet emotional needs slowly turn into resignation, teaching both hearts that connection requires courage, not avoidance. This is why the most powerful response to her ignoring is not anger, manipulation, or overpursuit, but calm clarity, emotional consistency, and honest communication, because these qualities create safety without pressure and invite openness without fear. At the same time, loving someone should never require you to abandon your own boundaries, self-respect, or emotional well-being, and recognizing when silence becomes emotional distance rather than temporary space is an act of self-love, not selfishness. When a woman truly loves and feels secure, her silence eventually transforms into conversation, her distance into closeness, and her fear into trust. But that transformation requires mutual effort, emotional maturity, and the willingness to face vulnerability together, because love is not proven by how much pain one can endure, but by how openly, respectfully, and consistently two people choose each other despite their fears. Eventually, the silence reaches a turning point where it either evolves into deeper understanding or quietly becomes a wall, because love cannot remain suspended in uncertainty forever. And when a woman who loves deeply continues to ignore you, it often means she is waiting for something unspoken to change, a shift in energy, effort, or emotional presence that reassures her heart that vulnerability will not be wasted. Sometimes she wants to see emotional courage, not grand gestures, but the willingness to listen without defensiveness, to communicate without control, and to show consistency without being asked, because safety is built through reliability rather than words alone. In other moments, her distance reflects her own healing process, a phase where she is learning that love should add to her life rather than consume it, and stepping back becomes a way to regain balance rather than reject connection. However, if ignoring turns into prolonged emotional absence, it may signal that love is being overshadowed by fear, pride, or avoidance, and no depth of feeling can compensate for the lack of communication, because love without expression slowly becomes loneliness. This is where acceptance becomes essential, acceptance that you cannot force clarity from someone who is not ready to face their emotions, and that walking away from emotional uncertainty can sometimes be the most respectful choice for both hearts. True love, when nurtured properly, does not rely on silence to be understood. It grows through openness, mutual vulnerability, and shared responsibility. And when a woman feels truly seen, valued, and emotionally safe, ignoring fades naturally, replaced by honesty and presence. But when it does not, the silence itself becomes the answer, teaching that love should bring peace more often than confusion, and that the right connection will not require you to constantly interpret distance as affection.